Parents often ask me about what's called screen time, and they're very worried about their children and screen time. And the first thing that I say to them is, well, let's talk about your screen time.
Mm.
Let's start there. Because if adults are going around, with their faces stuck in their devices, what's the point in talking about the children's screen time? And screen time is also sort of a reductive construct. It's like saying food without specifying what you're doing.
Mhm.
It's not food. It's, are you eating fresh vegetables or are you eating ice cream? They're both food, but, so screen time is really about the content. What are you doing? What we see in the latest research is the number of 2-year-olds who actually have their own social media platforms, who are, influencers or who are on
No
social
way,
media.
really.
So, and the amount of, very young children who have smartphones, and the stats just keep getting worse and worse and worse every time there's a study. And I think the thing that is missed is that in this sort of debate about screen time and devices, the fundamental piece, and that's what I write about in my book, The Cyber Effect, is it's about eye contact.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome Dr. Mary Aiken to my podcast. Dr. Aiken is one of the world's foremost cyberpsychologists. She's an academic advisor to Europol and has conducted research and training workshops with multiple global agencies, from Interpol to the FBI and the White House. So she has research interest in cybersecurity, organized cybercrime, cyber stalking, technology-facilitated human trafficking, and the rights of child online. She's a member of the advisory board of the Hague Justice Portal, a foundation for international peace, justice, and security. Her groundbreaking work inspired CBS television series CSI, Cyber. She's based in Ireland. Mary and I met at two occasions we met. Her son was the promoter for a show that Jordan put on, and Mary was there, and we had some nice conversations, and I asked her if she would go on my podcast. I was getting brave, and I asked her, and she said yes. So welcome to my podcast, Mary. Maybe you could just introduce yourself and tell everybody what you're doing, how long you've been doing it, why you're doing it.
Sure. So, Mary Aiken, I'm a professor of cyberpsychology and chair of the Department of Cyberpsychology at Capital Tech University in Washington, D.C, or in the D.C. area. I'm a professor of forensic cyberpsychology at the University of East London. And as you mentioned, Tammy, I'm an academic advisor to Europol, to the EC3, the Cybercrime Centre. And also I'm a member of the Interpol Global Cybercrime Specialist Group. So I first studied psychology back in the day and prior to the internet as we know it now, prior to social media. And I qualified and I started to work in industry and ended up working in marketing and advertising in an area which was consumer behavioral profiling. Trying to figure out in terms of people who purchase, say, for example, cereals, cornflakes, where the primary consumer, the parent, may not be the end user, the child. So Cocoa Pops and Rice Krispies and those sort of brands. And I spent many years working in that sector. And I first came across the beginnings of the internet in the early 90s when I was working on the West Coast, US West Coast. And a friend of mine who was a scientist had developed the world's first chatbot. in terms of this automated technology. I mean, chatbots have been around since the 50s, but this one was a conversational bot. I mean, when we have, ChatGPT now and everybody goes, oh my goodness, what a great new invention. Like, we've had lots of iterations of chat AI and ML driven chat functions over the years. But this chatbot was called Jabberwocky, and it was captivating. So it was a conversational bot, a piece of technology on a computer, the way we're talking now, if you were the bot. And I thought, wow, this is compelling. And I began to think of all the potential uses for this technology. And I thought about people suffering from social isolation. And I thought, wow, this could be great, a conversational bot that would just engage with them and talk back to them and address that isolation. And then I thought about children with specific learning difficulties or children on the spectrum. And I thought, wow, this could be a great, a tool in terms of helping that particular group. And then I stopped and I thought, or maybe not. Maybe this might be the worst thing that we could, put in front of vulnerable populations. And so that really sent me back to look at the literature, because nothing in my training in psychology to that point equipped me to understand the impact of this form of technology on humans. So I started to look at the literature, and I came across the work of a US professor called Professor John Suler, based at Rider University in the US. And I started reading his work, incredible work, from around, from 94 onwards, talking about this new topic, cyberpsychology. And again, before the internet as we know it now, before social media, before smartphones. And I just became sort of, consumed by it. And maybe it was because I had a background in psychology and because I was also working in marketing and advertising. I felt I really could see the potential of these new technologies. So I remember speaking to my professors at University College Dublin, where I had studied, and talking to them about this new discovery and saying, cyber psychology and chatbots and, the internet, and they're talking about, forums and social media groups online, and people will be able to communicate like this. And my professors said, cyber hocus pocus, humans will never communicate like that. And here we are.
Surprise,
So,
surprise.
so that's in me effectively. I had stopped enjoying the work I was doing in the marketing and advertising services sector, pushing sugared products to children. I just, I didn't enjoy it. It was extremely well paid. I'd risen to the level of senior vice president of the European board of an American public company. I have 8 different patents that are in my name, or that I'm party to the patent, and in terms of manufacturing process. And I stopped enjoying it. I just didn't want to do it. And what the organizations I was working with, they said, let's give her a bigger bonus. And I said, no, that's not the point. I don't enjoy this. And I really thought about, well, what am I going to do? And I decided to go back and to study cyberpsychology. So I left my very well paid job, put a sort of a satchel on my back, and went back to college and did a Master's of Science in cyberpsychology, which is the study of the impact of technology on humans. And I then followed that with a PhD in forensic cyberpsychology, which is the study of criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior online. And unfortunately, I'm kept very busy. And in fact, just before I had made that choice to go back, while I was still working in industry, I did a postgrad in forensic psychology. So forensic psychology is real world criminality. So real world crime scene, body on the floor, stab wounds. And I remember going to the lecture, and it had been, quite a while since I'd been in college, and I had decided to do this postgrad. And the lecturer was talking about forensic psychology and domestic homicide in particular. And he stood at the top of the class and he said, as we say in forensic psychology, if you want to live a long and healthy life, you should change your next of kin frequently. So in other words, the person most likely, we as women, we spend all our time worrying about dark car parks and, badly lit streets, but the person most likely to kill us is a husband or long-term boyfriend. And at that point, I thought, I really miss academia. I really miss this. So I went back and I requalified. And then when I finished my PhD, I did a postdoctoral fellowship, which is 1 year. I did it in cyberpsychology. And then in my second year postdoc, I changed topics and did a postdoctoral fellowship in network science on a project for the White House. Technology solutions to tech facilitated human trafficking. And then my third year postdoc, I did a research fellowship in cybercriminology. And then my fourth year postdoc, I did a research fellowship in information communication technology. And I thought, that's done. I'm probably suitably qualified now.
Sounds like it. You must have, do you have a number of professionals all over the world then that you can talk to now? Because now it's 20 years later or 30 years later?
Yes. So I'm still one of the few people to have 2 higher level degrees actually in cyberpsychology at this point in time. And probably because I saw it very early, so 20 years ago. And as you know, it takes time to requalify. Doing a doctorate can be 5 to 7 years, depending on 4, depending on how quickly you get through it. Doing your master's can be 2 or 3, depending again how you do it. So, I saw it very early that this was the future, and I decided to requalify. So I suppose I sort of was ahead of the game, if you will. But what we see now is a lot of people who are very interested in cyberpsychology. You see a lot of psychologists who maybe have tech skills calling themselves cyberpsychologists, but I would argue that's not the same thing. I think you need to do the qualification in the actual topic. But what I have done is I've set up the first online PhD in cyberpsychology with the team at CapTech in Washington, and we've the first PhD online in forensic cyberpsychology. And we've got quite a large number of students at the moment who are actually doing their PhD. And what's really interesting is that many of them are professionals who are already very well qualified. In fact, a number of the people who are doing our PhDs actually hold a PhD already. So they're they're upskilling. And I think that I've seen over the 20 years that I've been involved in cyberpsychology, I've seen increasing interest in the topic. And we see more journals, more publications. So I think that it's a sort of a difficult space. I mean, anybody who's familiar with academia will understand when I describe the difficulties of an interdisciplinary subject. So it's technology and psychology. I remember once being in London at, I think it was something to do with the Royal Society, and a professor there asking me, what was my PhD in? And I said, cyberpsychology. And he said, well, what's that? And I said, well, it's technology and psychology. And he said, aha, interdisciplinary. In other words, it was a snub, not good enough in either. Sort of 50-50.
Right.
But that's academia for you. It's not, I have lots of different areas that I work in. Academia is just sort of one silo. I've got to a stage in my professional career. It's actually called going plural. And that's where you do lots of different things at the same time. So you don't have, one career. You've got lots of different silos that you operate in. So for me, academia is just one silo. I enjoy it. I enjoy research, but I have the privilege and the pleasure of just deciding what sort of research I want to be involved in. So that's very liberating to be able to do that. And then the second area would be policing, the work that I do with Interpol and Europol, which is also very interesting and very important in a policy context in terms of the domain of cyberspace, which I'll explain in a minute. And then the third area is writing, say, the professional speaking circuit. So I work on the professional speaking circuit. I've just come back from Amsterdam. I'm going to Switzerland. I travel all over the world. And that's pretty cool because when you get a speaking offer, you can decide, well, do I like this event? Is this an area I'm interested in? Is this a place I want to visit? So it's no more than for you with Jordan on the speaking circuit. It's you can it's hard work, but you can also enjoy it. And then the fourth area is, say, work I do that is pro bono with various institutions and entities. And then the fifth area is sort of cool. It's broadly, say, entertainment. So television and different types of media, which is sort of fun, but like also an incredible platform for dissemination. As academics, we write papers and then maybe hope that maybe a couple of thousand people, and that would be a big number, may read those papers. When I did the show CSI Cyber, I think we aired at one stage in 170 countries, and the viewing audience was, into the late tens of millions, if not 100 million people. It was incredible. Mm-hmm. So that's it. Going plural, doing the things that I enjoy, and trying to make a difference as well.
Mm-hmm. And so cyberspace. So that would be, I guess that would be Interpol territory, would it, when you're talking about the cyberspace and what goes on there?
No, it's actually what we're doing now. We're in cyberspace.
We're in cyberspace, right?
We're in cyberspace. So this isn't transactional. We're not sitting across a table. I'm not talking to my computer. You and I have entered into this new domain, this environment, and it's the environment of cyberspace. And that's really important in a psychological context, because when we think about, so just to describe cyberspace, so the American military, in terms of joint protocols, conceptualize cyberspace as having three layers. So what you have is the network layer, which is the sort of the physical infrastructure, the hardware, the servers, the cables, the infrastructure that underlies the internet and cyberspace per se. And then you have the logical layer, which is the communication. So it's that connectivity between all of these different, domains. And then you have what they describe as the cyber persona layer. That's us, the humans. So you have these three layers of cyberspace. And effectively, what we see is that when people go online, and this is sort of 101 cyber psychology, what we notice is that human behavior can mutate or change in cyber contexts. And you have certain psychological or cyber psychological effects. For example, ODE, the online disinhibition effect. And it dictates that people will do things online that they wouldn't necessarily do in the real world. It can be described as being drunk online or a form of inebriation online. And you also have the power of anonymity online. So when you think about people hiding behind profiles, anonymous profiles, and their behavior, particularly on social media platforms and forums, that's a really powerful construct. You cannot be anonymous in the real world. It's almost impossible. For example, if you're traveling, can you imagine if you said, well, I want to travel behind this pseudo persona. I'll put a mask up for my face to go through, border control. I'll have an anonymous passport in somebody else's name. I mean, of course, there are criminal entities that do that, but general population can't do it. And it's a really interesting debate because people conflate anonymity with privacy. Privacy, you're a known entity and you choose to be very particular about who has your data. Anonymity is something different. You are not a known entity. And I think that, and I've had these debates, at the American Civil Liberties Union, um, whereby, some people will argue that anonymity online is a fundamental human right. And I argue, no, it is not. It is a 20-something-year-old invention of the internet, and one that we must question. And yes, of course, we want people in oppressed regimes to be able to tweet or post or whatever they want to do. But at what cost? And if the cost of that anonymous behavior is child sexual abuse and exploitation, is harassment, is cyber stalking, is trolling, is rampant organized crime, then arguably that's too great a cost for society. So we have to think about the greater good. We have to think about the power of anonymity, and we have to think of how it manifests in a cyber context. And if you think about it, really, it's a superhuman power of invisibility. If you think about the classics and, the gods who could appear and disappear. And that's now something that people can enjoy day to day. But it's a power that comes with great responsibility. And unfortunately, it's a power that is being abused. So I think, we have to question everything when it comes to the profound and pervasive impact of technology on humans, and also that impact on society in general. So if you think about the real world, so this is the real world, I'm in the real world, and we're talking in cyberspace. And cyberspace is an environment. So if you go back to the work of, say, environmental psychologists like Prochansky in the 1980s, they did a lot of work, a lot of study in terms of the impact of environment on behavior. So growing up in a certain home, in a certain street, in a certain neighborhood, and what that impact might be. Well, we've got the same thing in cyberspace. Kids are growing up online. That the environment of cyberspace is impacting their behavior. And in fact, when I wrote my book, The Cyber Effect, I have a copy of it here, and one of the people who wrote a review on the back of the book was Bob Woodward, Watergate Bob Woodward. And I was like, I couldn't believe that when I was writing the book, one of the editors working my book also knew Bob Woodward from a Washington connection. And she said, Mary, Bob is really interested in this book that you're writing. This was back in 2014, 2015. I was still doing a draft of the book. And she said, Bob would like to invite you to dinner in his house. And I thought, oh my goodness, dinner in Bob Woodward's house. Like what a thrill, to meet, such a legend in contemporary culture. And I went to dinner, and there were maybe 5 or 6 people at the dinner. And Bob literally interrogated me for the entire meal. I don't think I ate anything. I hardly drank anything. It was 2.5 hours. And to see somebody of that intellectual ability who knew very little about the topic at the beginning of the meal, but by the end of the meal had a really good working knowledge of the subject. I mean, that is just brilliance, to get from A to Z in that period of time. And the next day I rang Bob's wife and I said, look, I'm so embarrassed because I feel that the whole dinner was dominated by me talking about my new book. And, I just feel embarrassed. And she said, oh, Mary, don't worry. Bob's has Bob's rules. If Bob didn't want to talk about your book, we wouldn't have spoken about it. But he very kindly, he wrote a little review on the book, and he compared my work to that of Rachel Carson. Now, Rachel Carson wrote a book called The Silent Spring. An incredible, I mean, I don't conceptualize myself in that league, but She wrote a book about the big tech of the day, which is the agri sector, in terms of using pesticides. And she wrote a book called Silent Spring. And the book was about, well, what happens if when we wake up, if the birds aren't singing and there's no insects crawling around? And he compared my work to her work. And really it was a very, she was concerned about the real world environment. I was concerned about the environment of cyberspace. And we both wrote books saying, well, what if? And, I started with cyber babies in my book and went through every developmental age band and said, what should we be worried about? And the book was published in 2016. And it's, and here we are in 2024. And so much of it is still so very relevant today. I'll stop talking now, and
I'll ask you a question. You can talk some more.
I'm Irish. My husband says that if talking was an Olympic sport, I'd be a gold medalist.
Well, you got into the right profession because you have to talk. So you talk about cyber babies. I have grandchildren now. My kids, when they were little, there were no cell phones. The internet was just getting going when my little boy was 2 or 3, and in 1993 was when he was born. But these little kids now that are being born, they're born right in the thick of AI really taking off, and also the internet being in each of our homes and in each of our hands.
Yeah.
And I'd like to just ask you a few questions about like when do you allow your baby to have anything to do with that?
Parents often ask me about what's called screen time, and they're very worried about their children and screen time. And the first thing that I say to them is, well, let's talk about your screen time. Let's start there. Because if adults are going around, with their faces stuck in their devices, what's the point in talking about the children's screen time? And screen time is also sort of a reductive construct. It's like saying food without specifying what you're doing. It's not food. It's, are you eating fresh vegetables or are you eating ice cream? They're both food, but, so screen time is really about the content. What are you doing? And, there are guidelines, the APA have guidelines which, say that, children, no screen time under a certain age. I think it's 18 months, and then, or maybe 2 years now, these guidelines keep getting updated, but no screen time for very young infants. And then, in the next block, which might be 2 to, or from 3 to 5, limited exposure to screens and only supervised by parents and only playing, engaging with appropriate content. But that's in an ideal world. But what we see in the latest research is the number of 2-year-olds who actually have their own social media platforms, who are, influencers or who are on social media. So, and the amount of, very young children who have smartphones, and the stats just keep getting worse and worse and worse every time there's a study. And I think the thing that is missed is that in this sort of debate about screen time and devices, the fundamental piece, and that's what I write about in my book, The Cyber Effect, is it's about eye contact. Eye contact. That's the, elephant in the cyber room. If the parents are looking at their devices, and if the children are looking at the devices, then the part that's missing is eye contact. So the face of a human infant was designed to be the most engaging and the most compelling thing on the planet in terms of that that premise of eye contact, which is the core of the sort of bonding process, which is also like Bowlby and attachment theory. It's a basic psychological premise in terms of good practice in terms of raising of bonding with an infant. And we've now had this invention that's more compelling than the face of an infant. And I write about it in one of the chapters in the book, that it was a sort of an ethnographic observation piece, that I was sitting on a train, taking a long train journey, and opposite me, a woman was feeding her baby. And while she was feeding the baby, the baby was gazing lovingly at his mother's jaw while the mother gazed lovingly at her smartphone. And that to me just sort of captured a moment of, what are we doing here? And so eye contact, and if you think about eye contact in the infant, I mean, children who fail to have enough eye contact with their parents or caregivers will fail to bond with them. Children who fail to bond will go on to have lifelong problems in terms of attachment, at levels of extreme levels, of course. But I think that when you think about the household and you think about the number of technology distractions in the household, if dad is on his phone and mom's on her iPad and the brothers and sisters are playing, computer games, who's baby going to make eye contact with? The family pet in the corner? I mean, and I suppose beyond the technology, it's really getting into the realm of, human behavior and how it may be impacting us. I mean, there are lots of areas in terms of, there's a great neuroscientist called Susan Greenfield who I've met, and she's a professor, and she's written extensively about her concerns about the impact of technology on the developing child in a neurological context. And she's been, attacked publicly for stating her concerns. So, as always in psychology, and I'm sure you've heard about this from Jordan, there are lots of factions. And, ironically, some of the people that I've come across that can be most vicious online are those who come actually from a social science background, which is a paradox in its own right.
Well, I wonder how much of this has to do with addiction behavior, because you talk about internet addiction, but there's even it doesn't even have to be internet addiction. It can be the addiction of the phone itself. I think is addicting, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's designed to addict, if, in an area called signal theory, it uses noises to get our attention. It uses lights to flash to get our attention. It can, vibrate in your pocket to get your attention. It's designed to be compelling. I think the addiction debate is a tricky one, because I'm not somebody who believes in device addiction or internet addiction per se, because if you think about addiction, then to counter addiction, you're really talking about abstinence, to say, if you're talking about alcohol or drug addiction, the classic addictions. However, we can't be addicted to air. We can't be addicted to water. The idea that you create an addiction model around technology use is not going to be one that's going to be possible to contemplate, because we're at a point in time where you have to get engaged with technology to live, to work, to live, to bank, to healthcare. Everything has some techno component to it. So I prefer to think of it, and also we have to remember that in DSM terms, there's no such thing as internet addiction, and there's no such thing as smartphone addiction, and that's a problem. I think that's also rooted in a larger problem with the behavioral sciences and psychology in particular is that the call for so DSM is the, Bible, if you will, of all sorts of, psychological, clinical conditions. And the call for proposals for the current edition, current DSM, which is DSM-5, which was published, I believe, in 2013. So the call for proposals, so areas that we should be looking at, and scientists and great debate, started in the early 2000s, before social media and before smartphones. So the cutoff point for all the debates and, was somewhere around 2008, 2009. I mean, I'm not part of that process, but, it was in that sort of period. And the fact that there wasn't, there was some debate during that process around internet addiction, but it was for the work of Young, I believe, was the primary research or landmark research in that area at that time. But it was far too early in the cycle to actually say what's the impact. And social media didn't exist in the form it is now, and smartphones certainly didn't exist. So the fact that we now in 2025, and this is the only manual that we have no such thing as smartphone addiction, is that because smartphone addiction doesn't exist, or is it because DSM was actually, published in a time period, or the build up to it was, before these entities became, popular in contemporary society. So I think that's one sort of debate to consider. But I prefer to think of it as maladaptive behavior. It's like biting your nails when you get nervous. I think certainly these technologies are designed to be addictive, for addictive type behaviors, as opposed to a clinical definition of addiction. But I think that what we can do is we can do something about it.
So what would be a good habit with your phone?
Well, lots of different things. So first of all, if we think about technology in the developing child, first of all, we have to think of this in a familial context. We have to think about everybody's use of technology as well as the developing child. So that, I would say, would be the first step. The second would be to look at the APA guidelines, and I can post the latest guidelines after this session for anybody who might be interested in looking at them. And then try to follow, well, what's best practice? What they should they be looking at what point in time? The thing is that there was a huge body of work done in real world psychology by people like Piaget in terms of stages of development, where parents, when they had an infant, it's like, what age should they sit up and when should they take their first step? And, you could follow this. We don't have the equivalent in terms of cyber stages of development. And I think that's a real gap, something that parents could look at and would guide them step to step in terms of best practice. Because you've got all of these different critical age bands that are important. And certainly, developing digital literary skills and developing tech skills should be part of a child's development, but only in an age appropriate way. And I was having this discussion with some, colleagues and some academics and some technical people, and there's a consensus that smartphones actually probably in the next 10 to 15 years will be banned in terms of their use by children.
Mm-hmm. Well, and will there be phones by that time anyway, with AI coming? Maybe they're already obsolete. We'll see soon.
Will we humans even be talking to each other?
Yeah, right.
Or will we all just be hanging out with our chatbots? I think that, so when it comes to the older child, again, parents say to me, well, what's the best age to give a smartphone to my child? And I think was it Gates said that he wouldn't give a smartphone to a child under the age of 14.
Yeah, and I think that Jonathan Haidt, didn't he say Didn't he say like 18 or something? He's
Well, that's a little old.
yeah,
I'm conservative, but even for me, that's maybe a little old. I think certainly in the early teens, young people should be capable of navigating smartphones. But I would really worry about the 8, 9, 10, 11 year olds. They, again, in a psychological context, you've got, Erickson's period of identity formation when everybody's trying to figure out who am I and what am I? And then you've all these multiple personas online. I mean, we did some research recently and found that on any given platform, a majority of the youth that we surveyed had up to 5 or 6 identities on one platform. So one true identity and then multiple different variations of self. Well, I'm sure that's fantastic when you're 25, but I would be very concerned about, a 9-year-old having multiple identities, apart from the risk, just even from the point of considering, well, what does that do to the construct of self? And this whole piece about self-presentation online as well that I write about in my book, in terms of, what we see is this very aspirational self online, and a curated self who's always looks well and their hair is shiny and they're stretched to be 5 pounds lighter and they've got white teeth and by use of filters. Well, what about the poor real world self? Does it have to stay hidden in the basement, a sort of reverse Dorian Gray, where the real world self is like, can't be brought out in public because they can never live up to this idealized version of self? But I think if you look at young children around that age, say between 8 and 11 and 12, if you keep them away from smartphones and say, for example, give them a dumb phone, which might be, handy for parents to communicate, I'm running late to pick you up, or, whatever communication. A dumb phone, just you can text and call. And if you remove a camera, the internet, and social media from a phone, you remove about 95% of the problems associated with mobile phone use. So they're the sort of guidelines that I would like to see coming into play, sort of sensible guidelines that could help parents to navigate, children's use of a technology in a constructive way. And also teaching them about basic cybersecurity, what's the 101 of, staying safe online. And if you think about, we've had sort of, 15 to 20 years now of young people being exposed to technology in one way or another and to varying degrees. And what we see across the board is increasing levels of anxiety and depression. We see increasing levels of narcissism, and these are like sort of general studies. And, we see increasing levels of self-harm, cutting, self-starvation, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. And if you plot this in a chart, you will see that these increases almost mimic identically the penetration of the net and the proliferation of devices. Now, as scientists, we're not allowed to say correlation equals causation, but I'm sorry, I'm going to say there's definitely a relationship. And we haven't had the investment in the sort of research that we need to establish the specifically what's happening, but the trends are there. You get lots of research, and you get all sorts of people who conduct research because they've got sort of a mindset of tech is all good, and their research tends to find, oh, it's fantastic for kids. And then you've got maybe others who say, well, no, this is harmful, and they conduct research. So as in many things, psychology and the behavioral sciences is very divided on the topic. But what we see is a growing trend worldwide. In fact, there are congressional hearings in the US, I believe on the 31st of January, which will be looking specifically, calling the CEOs of big tech in for congressional hearings in terms of their failure to protect children online. So what we see is this growing movement worldwide, and I've been part of it in many different countries. Um, on the policy side, I've worked from everybody from UK government through to the White House, the EU in lots of different forms, which is the European, our European governing body, the EU Commission. And what we see is a growing movement recognizing the need to afford children a greater protection online. So that's, a definite sort of a global movement. In the UK, we've had the introduction of the Online Safety Act, and it specifically moves to protect children in terms of mechanisms around age verification and identity verification online. There is no shallow end of the swimming pool in cyberspace, in the internet, and effectively, technology was designed on the premise that all users are equal. This is not true. Some are more equal and more capable than others. Some are extremely vulnerable online. So with the General Online Safety Act in the UK, for the first time, what's been established is a spectrum of harm, of online harm, as opposed to real world harm. And this spectrum of harm ranges from cyberbullying through to harassment, through to mis and disinformation, through to cyber fraud. So the things that can negatively impact humans online. And it's an incredible piece of work. I've worked for 7 years in many different areas in terms of supporting this legislation. And in tandem with producing the legislation, what the UK government has done, which again is a worldwide first, and I would love to see it replicated in other countries. And again, I've worked very closely in this area, many, many different research reports that I've been involved in. So what we have is coming back to the 3 layers of cyberspace. So you've got the 2 sort of technical layers, which is the infrastructure and the connectivity, and then you've got the human layer. Now, we've had 50 or 60 years of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity protects your data, your systems, your devices. It does not protect what it is to be human online. So we've the evolution of this new sector called the online safety technology sector, or SafetyTech for short, like health tech, fintech, safety tech. And the aim of this sector is to protect humans online and to come up with all sorts of technology solutions that can do that. And if you think about bullying or harassment or stalking or fraud or mis or disinformation, these harms have the characteristics of big data: volume, velocity, variety. In other words, there's a lot of it. And therefore, we need AI and ML solutions. So last year, I was principal investigator on the first report to actually establish the US safety tech sector. We found evidence of an emerging billion-dollar market. And this is where you can truly find solutions, because if you can identify a problem space, and then if you can incentivize the creation of business and startups to address these problems, and if you can support that, what you're doing is you're driving innovation, you're building business, you're creating jobs, and you're providing automated solutions to complex socio-tech problems. So it's a win-win. You get to develop the economy and you address these problems.
Sounds like a good idea, because I imagine what we're talking about there is child trafficking.
Yes. So that would also include, for example, what's called CSAM, so child sexual abuse material, the trafficking of children, the exploitation of children. And, what's incredible is that, I don't know if you remember, a couple of years ago, Apple tried to bring in a new technology to address the amount of, what in the US is called child pornography. We don't use that term in other jurisdictions because, well, it's not considered an appropriate term, but it is the legal term in the US. And they were trying to address that content that was being, on their devices or hosted on their sort of, cloud services that they were, concerned about. And there was a complete pushback and about it. People felt that their privacy might be compromised. And here's that trade-off again. Here's that trade-off in terms of, I've had the honor of working very closely with Chris Inglis, who's an incredible, a brilliant strategic thinker, and is the former U.S. National Cyber Director. And he pointed out to me that there are three aims there should be three aims in civil society, which is an aim of privacy, an aim of vitality of the tech sector, and an aim of collective security. And to keep balance, none of those aims should have primacy over the other. And the point at which privacy begins to be more important than collective security, and I would put, the exploitation of children and general population into that sort of area, then we have a problem. And there are technologies that exist that can detect this material, and that can detect all of the material that's been tagged and flagged up by law enforcement. There's a company called Cybercrime have actually developed a brilliant technology, which is privacy preserving, even on encrypted platforms, to actually stop, think of it as a filter to stop the circulation of this content. And yet that hasn't been deployed by governments. So I think it probably will in time, once we get over this idea of, that adults' right to privacy in terms of the very personal spaces that they use online, in terms of their use of technology, that's a greater right than the right of a child, to be not to be abused in cyber contexts. These are debates that have to be held at a public and policy level, where we as a society have to decide in every jurisdiction, are we going to continue to allow this to happen? Because, when I work with law enforcement in this area, every image of a child that's being exploited or abused is a crime scene. And, we have to stop the circulation of these images online, because the victim is re-victimized. And also, back in the day, we had a certain cohort who were interested in generating these images, and they were child-related sex offenders, which you might conceptualize as pedophiles, but there's a difference between the two, but let's just call them broadly child-related sex offenders. And they would groom a child, and they would groom them to the point of actually capturing the image. And they did that because they had a sexually deviant interest in the child. And fortunately, that's a very relatively low percentage of people in general population that will do that. But you remember Stranger Danger and Catch a Predator? Do you remember all the focus was on that? And now you don't hear that so much. And the reason you don't hear that so much is now there's a whole new cohort who are grooming children, masquerading as a 13-year-old boy, some anonymous profile talking to a 12-year-old girl, trying to get her to generate an explicit image, and then taking that image and then using it to blackmail her and extort her to get more images, and vice versa as well, in terms of young boys are also targeted in this way. And the reason for that is because there are now markets for these images in the darkest parts of the internet. So therefore, anybody with an economic interest in exploiting the child is now joining in this sort of criminal behavior. So, that brings me to the topography of the internet. If you think about it, what we're doing now, we're talking, but we're on the surface web. And that is only between, estimates of sort of 3 to 5% of the internet, like the tip of the iceberg. The rest of it, in law enforcement, we call it what lies beneath. and that is the deep web. And in the deep web, you've a part, and that's just content not searchable by standard search engines like, Google, for example. It's content that's not indexed. And then within that, you have the dark web, and you have dark nets functioning in the dark web. And these are what we describe in forensics as offender convergence settings. This is where the criminality takes place. This is where you can go and rent or buy or an exploit to undertake ransomware. This is where the images are traded. This is where you can buy drugs and guns and assassins for hire. This is a very...
Piracy.
Exactly. Yes. Silk Road was shut down now. So that's, yeah, exactly. And given that symbiotic relationship between cyberspace and the real world, what happens in the real world impacts on cyber, what happens in cyberspace impacts on the real world, as long as this part of the internet doesn't fall under real world governance, and people in that domain aren't accountable in the same way that they are in the real world. And that's because of the power of anonymity of Tor, where the behavior can be masked, and it's much more difficult for law enforcement to actually police that part of the internet. And it's also international. It's not bound in one jurisdiction. And I wrote a paper about it 2 years ago, and pointing to this problem in a policing context. And the paper started off by discussing the thin red line. And the thin red line came from the Battle of Balaclava, when the Scottish regiment, who were wearing their red jackets, spread out to create a very thin line to resist the charge of the Russian cavalry. And that became a metaphor for a very thinly stretched resource trying to combat overwhelming force. And then that sort of transposed into the real world and became the thin blue line, which is a term in policing. Again, this thinly stretched resource trying to combat overwhelming force, But the cavalry charge is now taking place in cyberspace. And my report, which Europol published, is called the Cyber Blue Line. Mm-hmm. And effectively questioning the social contract that exists between civil society and police or law enforcement in terms of what do we want from our police forces. This relationship has evolved over, hundreds and hundreds of years, but in an age of technology, I believe has to be reconsidered, and has to be reconsidered in a global context, because we're losing the battle on the cyber frontier. Cybercrime is rampant. If cybercrime was a country, it would have the third biggest GDP after the US and China.
Yeah, I bet that's true. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, if you imagine... We imagine the oceans and how big the oceans are. We can't even imagine that, living in the places that we live, to imagine that there are pirates all over the ocean and going from landmass to landmass, and also a Silk Road of people moving, which these things are beginning, they're happening in the world, but I can imagine on the internet, this is something that is very advanced.
Absolutely. And children can be sex tourism. You don't need to go and visit a country to exploit a child. It can be done virtually.
Yeah.
So
right.
The barrier to entry to engage in cybercrime has been lowered. And it means that it's pretty open for everybody to get involved. And the thing that underpins social justice systems worldwide is the construct of consequence, consequence for behavior. And that is a major deterrent, except when it comes to online, because there are very few consequences to that behavior online in terms of a numbers game. If you go out.
Then when a young woman decides that she has her first boyfriend and she's 14 years old, and she sends him a picture with her breasts revealed,
Yeah.
and she sends that to him, then there's a way for that picture to be taken. Or
Oh,
is
yeah.
it or is it private?
Oh, well, it's not private, nothing. It's like a secret. The only way to ensure that you can keep a secret is to not to tell anyone. The only way that you can ensure something remains absolutely private is not to share.
Hmm.
It's just it's yes, it can be on an encrypted platform, but you're not absolutely sure if it's somebody that you've just met online. If they are a 14-year-old boy who's maybe
Right.
has been your boyfriend, they could be a 50-year-old man, masquerading as a 14-year-old boy. It's just, and in a and even in a if it is a boyfriend, sharing that sort of digital evidence. I mean, back in the day, young people are sexually curious, but of course, that's normal behavior. Back in the day, people went behind the cowshed and played strip poker or spin the bottle. We didn't collect digital evidence that was stored, and that's the difference. And I think that that's a very, very difficult developmental path for children to navigate and young people to navigate. And if you think about it in terms of the definition of of an indecent or explicit image, which informs, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, either the child pornography, you know, legislation or the child sexual abuse material. If you are a minor and if the image is explicit and you have captured the image as a selfie and you've disseminated it, you are de facto producing and disseminating child pornography, albeit of yourself. So, the complexity, and I've written a lot about the complexity of, the legal process trying to keep up with the constant technological innovation, trying to keep up with the developmental innovation in regarding young people. It's a balancing act. Um, and very often the people who suffer are the children, and yet we don't hold those who profit in the space, the social tech companies, and I call them social tech because I include social media and search in that broad descriptor. And they're the ones who profit from, what's called, I think Wu called it the attention economy, the monetization of young people's attention, using these platforms, pushing ads to them, monetizing that, and then with very little consideration of the behavior, of how you monitor the behavior, how you encourage good behavior, how you restrict undesirable behaviors, that responsibility. These companies are 40,000 people who work in the trust and safety area, which is the traditional area that helps with child protection online, as just as one issue. 40,000 people have been let go in the last year or so from these big companies. So there's definitely a shift happening. It'll be interesting to watch the hearings and see, well, what is the outcome? What are governments going to do about it? I know what the UK government is doing. I know what they're trying to do in the EU. In Ireland, we're a bit behind. It'll be something similar to the UK, but not as comprehensive. Australia has its own approach. So you see lots of different approaches in different countries, but the problems are global and the problems are reasonably uniform. Young people tend to be young people the world over, and therefore we need, global solutions. And I think when you talk about global solutions in cyber contexts, everybody gets very territorial about, well, we're the US and we've got this, and we're the UK. But there are things that we can agree on. And I would say that certainly the exploitation and trafficking of minors is certainly something that we should all be able to agree on of how we're going to tackle it.
Hmm. Sounds very complicated, but it sounds like something that will keep you busy.
Yes, yes. Well, I work in like so many different areas, and I do so deliberately. I work in areas in terms of educational psychology, which is, infants, all the way through to teenagers, young adults. You can see in my book, I cover so many different topics.
You do, yes, yes. It's extensive.
Cyberchondria, which is a form of health.
Many good stories too. You have many good stories in your book as well. I enjoyed reading it.
Oh, thank you.
Oh yeah,
Thank you.
it was informative, and it was historical too, because you bring in a lot of stories to give to context to each of these issues, and that's very, very helpful.
Yeah, you're trying to explain, but the thing is as well that everything keeps changing. So first of all, it's all connected. What happens with the developing infant in time could become the 13-year-old hacker, in time could become, you know what I mean? There's a developmental piece here. We have this like siloed approach to subjects and to topics in society. Kids sit over here, teenagers sit here, young adults sit here, professionals here, so cyber criminals over here. It's all connected. And in fact, I've just finished as a research lead on a 3-year pan-European EU project for the European Commission. And we did one of the largest surveys ever undertaken regarding sort of cybercrime and youth cybercrime in particular. So we surveyed 8,000 young people from 9 countries, aged 16 to 19. And the results are quite astounding. What we found, it's a survey, so it's self-report. It's young people talking about their behavior online, but it was very, very extensive survey, like a large number of questions and lots of different, psychological scales and adaptive scales built into the survey. So, very robust scientific piece of work. And what we found was that almost 50% of the sample of the 8,000 young people surveyed admitted to engaging in at least one form of cybercrime in the previous year. So that's sort of catastrophic for society if that's the way we're heading, because we can sit here and say, well, we're here and the cyber criminals are over there as some sort of different cohort. But when we've got young people now who've got a different moral compass, who grew up on downloading, pirated music and, stepping up to pirated software, and now not seeing much wrong with a little bit of identity theft or credit card fraud, actively engaged in money muling, actively engaged in cyber fraud. And the incidence of digital piracy is quite high. It's 1 in 3. But even when you get to more severe behaviors, for example, money muling or cyber fraud, it's like 1 in 10, 1 in 11. And these are very, very large numbers. But it's a different moral compass, and it points to that mutation or change of behavior in cyber contexts. And that was what my book actually was discussing. The cyber effect, I argued it's the E equals MC squared of this century. It's that amplification and escalation of behavior online. And if we could figure out what that was, we could also mathematically look at how we could de-escalate. But it was published worldwide. It was a bestseller in some regions. And there was actually a Chinese edition and a Russian edition. And I'm very proud of that, because it meant my little tech book got past the Great Firewall of China. It got into Russia. And it really points to, coming back to what I was saying, is, we're all in this together. There are things we can disagree about, but there must be things that we agree on. And I think that's where we can have progress.
Yes, and we have to agree or disagree about regulating or not regulating, right? Which is what you say in your book.
Yes. I don't think we can prosecute our way out of the problem space, because the legal system is not going to keep pace with evolving technology. But that doesn't mean we can't have best practice. That doesn't mean that we can't have accountability. And the UK legislation is very much going in the direction of duty of care. So saying to the companies, again, who profit in this space, you have a duty of care to the user, and you have a very specific duty of care to minors, to young people, a very, very specific duty of care. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that legislation pans out. But I think it's a big step forward in cyberspace. I'd love to see something similar happening in the US, a little more challenging with with the different system and issues around, First Amendment, and so I think, but nonetheless, what you see is a growing movement in lots of ways in the states of different states doing their own thing in terms of trying to police cyberspace, if you will, particularly when it comes to children online. So I think it's very interesting times. Um, but I also think that our generation, people who are adult, will be held accountable. I think people will look back and say, well, you were the people in charge, the people could, the scientists, the academics, the policymakers, the parents, you could have done something. And that's what I suppose motivates me, is I will never look back and say, I didn't try my best, because I do this all day, every day. And I enjoy my work. It's very dark often, and, can be quite lots of different problematic areas. But I remain optimistic because I can see the solutions. I see technology solutions to technology facilitated harmful, problematic, and criminal behavior. If you think about it in a real world context, you're driving on a motorway and there's a camera and it takes a photograph of you because you're speeding. And it recognizes the reg plate on your car, and then it pings back to a database that knows it's your car. And the next thing, within a week or two, you get a fine in the post. That's the way it works in the UK and Europe. I'm sure it's pretty similar in the States.
I'm in this way, yeah.
And nobody thinks anything about that. They just go, okay, I was speeding and I got caught. That's not, and yet, if we tried to do something similar on the superhighways of cyberspace, there'd be an outcry. There'd be, hands off. Yet, in the real world, that's how we live. That's how we reduce speeding. That's how we stop accidents. So I think applying those sort of technological interventions online will be necessary. And if you think about cyberspace as a sort of a spectrum, on the far left, you have a cohort who lobby, and they are the freedom of the internet brigade. They are the keyboard warriors. They are hands off the internet. And there's a sort of like an ideological fundamentalism there of this is, there's something that was invented not to be regulated. And then on the far right, you've got big tech. And they've also got an ideology which is based around the cost of governance is expensive. So therefore, they don't want too much regulation because, they want to be free to make as much money as they can while they can. But these two entities, although they're sitting at either ends of the spectrum, are sort of aligned in cyber contexts. And we, the 99.99% of us and our children, we get to sit in the middle and have no say in this domain. And that's where I argue we need to, Leonard Cohen style, we need to take cyberspace, we need to take back cyberspace and say, no, this is where children are growing up. This is where, young children are hanging out. This is where people are, working, living, playing, making relationships. We've got to have a say in cyberspace. We have to have a say, because if we don't, it will negatively impact real world society. And I'm somebody who is conservative, and makes no apology for wanting to see the sort of law and order protocols that we have in place in the real world, wanting to see them replicated online.
Fair enough. For our children, I understand that for sure.
And for people who are vulnerable, there are lots
Yeah,
and lots of,
vulnerable for sure.
the,
Well,
the,
and that that's gone too far in the real world, because we've taken to believe that uh, everyone that we decide is vulnerable, and they have to be protected. But I think that's a sign of that the real world has been around long enough that we're coming to the end of some of these ideas, whereas in the internet we're at the beginning. So it's pretty free, and free is good, but there's also damage. There's damage control, because at this point there's no damage control, and so there's a lot of trouble, and there's a lot of people being harmed, and so it's bound to get regulated. It's
yeah.
just bound to. It has to.
Yeah, and I suppose like we don't want, the nanny society of the real world replicated online either.
No.
I wouldn't advocate for that, but I'm just saying, some basic things like let's,
Yeah.
for example, get child sexual abuse material and all child pornography off the net. Is that too big
Yeah.
an ask? I don't think
Yeah.
so. You
No.
know,
Or
it's
yeah. Somehow,
it's
somehow to regulate that. That's for sure. And like
that's
you said, you have to solve tech with tech.
absolutely, absolutely. And we can come up with smart solutions. The problem is there's been a lot of money in new tech iterations. So, for example, what we're doing now, and then you've got virtual reality, and then you've got meta and the metasphere, and everybody's like, fantastic, here's something new. But there's no money in saying, well, maybe that's not going to work. Maybe we shouldn't do that. I mean, if
Hmm.
you take,
Hmm.
for example, cyberbullying online. Okay, fine. So we're not on top of cyberbullying in cyber context. And then you create this new metaverse, this new universe that is virtual reality. And the psychological premise of virtual reality is that it is a more psychologically immersive and therefore more powerful experience. Okay, fantastic. But you get this cyber utopian view, a sort of a cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is you can enjoy drinking red wine. You know it's bad for you, but you justify it by saying, but it's the end of a very long week and it makes me feel relaxed. And therefore, you resolve that conflict by sort of rationalizing why you do it. And that's effectively what's happening with the new tech design. It's a cognitive dissonance. It's only looking at the upside. This is going to be a fantastic, more powerful experience. Now, let's apply that differently. Let's look at cyberbullying, mediated by technology on social media, where a child might be targeted, 24/7, and that's very distressing for them. Now, imagine being in a virtual reality environment where 300 people turn on you in virtual reality. That's going to be far more psychologically damaging than on a more lean medium. But nobody's talking about that. So it's just always the upside. It's always, this is going to be fantastic. When the platforms first started to live stream, clearly one of the things that was going to happen was that we would see murders live or extreme violence live. And of course, that has happened. And, I'm very, very concerned about the amount of extremely violent content and graphic content that's currently being circulated online as news. And no matter what conflict you're talking about, you know, children should not be looking at this content. It's traumatic for them. You can have vicarious trauma from looking at something that's an extreme image. And the people who are actually circulating the extreme content are doing it to gain sympathy for their cause. This, let's show everybody what's happening, whatever conflict it is. And what they're doing is entirely counterproductive, because when you show people extreme content, what do? You desensitize them. What does that mean? They have lower levels of empathy. So it's not even achieving what people want it to achieve, apart from the fact that it can be very, very damaging for those who are young, those who are vulnerable, those who have previous trauma, and yet, we've got this spiral, this descent into to everybody should see everything all of the time, and that's not how civilized societies should function. When I'm talking to young people, I say to them, there is no command delete file for the brain. What is seen cannot be unseen. And all of the responsibility is put back onto parents. Well, you should control what your child is looking at online, but that's not possible. We don't ask parents to go and man the doors to bars, or to stop children being served drink underage. We put the responsibility on the people who are profiting in the space. We so I think that, and people talk about parental controls. Well, if you Google bypassing parental controls, you'll get a million results. You won't sleep tonight, but you'll see what your kid knows. So I think that there has to be a greater responsibility in terms of, protecting children online. You start with that. I agree that you don't want to go to the extremes of everybody has to be protected to the nth degree, where where what Seligman in psychology would call learned helplessness, where you get so protected we're incapable of actually doing anything to help ourselves. But certainly, society will pay a heavy price for neglecting children development in critical developmental periods.
Yeah. And I think what we're seeing now with this large child trafficking rings that we're seeing now is it's a new platform for us, and we haven't realized just how powerful it is. And but to I just until I really looked at child trafficking, I never thought of it like I do now. And I see, oh my goodness, when you sell a diamond, you sell it once.
Yeah.
But when you rent a child, you rent it over and over and over and over again. And there's nothing more horrible to think of than that. And so we have to do something about this.
Yeah, and what we see now is AI generated child sexual abuse material,
Right?
and the criminals working in that area now are using all the material that exists in the world as data in their domain, as data training sets, in setting the AI a task of generating the most extreme things it can think of. And technology very often pulls towards the extreme again in this like attention economy. If you ever start watching a video of police car chases, it'll start off with the car bumping into something, and eventually you'll see people being knocked down, and very extreme content. And that's what the algorithm does, is it pulls towards the extreme to keep your attention, to keep monetizing the attention. And we're going to see this with child sexual exploitation material. We're going to see AI generated content that is extreme, that is beyond the imagination of humans. But in turn, humans looking at that content, then their behavior arguably will become more extreme. And that's AI augmenting human behavior in terms of criminal behavior. So it's not something that we can stand back from. I
Right.
think it's something that we have to actively engage with in terms of active regulation, best practice, common sense,
Common
and
sense.
to try and create a safer and more secure cyberspace.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, I think that I've taken up plenty of your time, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us here. Is there anything else you'd like to give us in
Um,
conclusion?
No, I think we've covered a lot of
Good.
topics, and I think that I mean anybody who's interested in my research in that area, my publications are all available online. I'm doing some pretty cool work in the area of IARPA has become interested in cyber psychology informed sort of active defense.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are under a cyber attack, effectively, it's not legal to attack back. That's called a hack back, and that's not legal. But there's this slight gap of opportunity where it's actually legal to psychologically hack back and try and deter cyber attackers. So this is like a fascinating area
Mm-hmm.
because it offers opportunity to do something constructive rather than just like defending the perimeter of your business, your network. It has that sort of deterrent value that you can actually do something and there are consequences to the behavior. So
Mm-hmm.
I just did a paper published with some colleagues, some scientists last week, and the paper is titled "The Enterprise Strikes Back." And it's
Mm-hmm.
the concept of industry-led active cyber defense. Can't believe the paper made it through peer review intact, but it did. And and these things, like, okay, there's a lot that's very dark and very problematic, but when you get to work on something like that, that's fun and that can actually be a paradigm shift and a little bit of a breakthrough, it's very, very rewarding.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh, congratulations. That's great.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again. And I hope you have a wonderful day today.
Thank
I
you,
guess
Kelly. Thank you for
my
your
day's just
time.
starting. Yours might be not as early as mine.
No, it's a little later here. It's dark.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. And
Thank
it's
you.
Friday night, so I'll probably have that glass of wine.
Good idea.
Thank you.